She stood at the plaintiff's table in a charcoal blazer that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and she smiled the way people smile when they are absolutely certain the outcome has already been decided. Her attorney, a man named Garrison Holt, who wore cufflinks shaped like scales of justice, the irony of which he appeared entirely immune to, shuffled his papers with the practiced confidence of someone who had never once considered that he might be wrong. The courtroom was quiet in that particular way. Courtrooms get quiet when everyone in the room is waiting for someone to be destroyed. That someone, they believed, was Daniel Voss. Daniel sat at the defendant's table in a suit that had been cleaned but not pressed, a detail Garrison Holt had already noted and filed away as evidence of exactly the kind of man he was dealing with. Daniel's attorney, a woman named Priya Anand, who charged considerably less per hour than Garrison Holt but understood numbers with a precision that Holt had long since delegated to paralegals, sat beside him reviewing a manila folder. Daniel himself was very still, not the stillness of a man who was afraid, the stillness of a man who had decided, some time ago, how this was going to go. The judge entered. Everyone rose. Before we go any further, if you're watching this from somewhere new today, drop your city in the comments below. This community spans more countries than I can count, and I love knowing where these stories land. Hit that like button if you've ever watched someone underestimate the wrong person. And stay with me, because this story, Daniel's story, is one you are going to want to see all the way through. It ends somewhere that man in the cufflinks never saw coming. Now, let's go back to where it started. 14 months before that courtroom morning, Daniel Voss had been standing in a different kind of room entirely. The kitchen of the house he had spent 9 years helping to pay for, renovate, and maintain. A Victorian-style home in a mid-sized city in the Pacific Northwest that sat on a corner lot and had the kind of wraparound porch that made strangers slow their cars to look. He had refinished that porch himself over a single long weekend the summer before, crouching in the August heat with a belt sander and a thermos of coffee, because the contractor's quote had come in at $4,000, and he'd thought, I can do this. And he had. He was good at doing things himself, had been since childhood, raised by a single mother in a small apartment, where the answer to most problems was, figure it out. He'd figured out a path through a state university on a combination of scholarships and night work. He'd figured out a career in financial consulting, specifically in the kind of forensic financial analysis that untangled the knotted-up books of companies in dispute, finding the numbers that people had hoped would stay hidden. He was, professionally speaking, a man whose entire skill set was built around finding what others had missed. His wife, Camille, had always described his work to her friends as something with accounting, which was the verbal equivalent of describing surgery as something with knives. It was accurate at the most superficial level and conveyed nothing of the substance. He had learned not to correct her at dinner parties. It wasn't worth the look she gave him when he tried. Camille Voss, née Beaumont, came from the kind of family that had money the way other families have furniture. It had always been there. No one quite remembered acquiring it, and its absence was essentially unimaginable. Her parents, Gerald and Patricia Beaumont, lived 12 minutes away in a house with a name, not a street number, a name, and they had never fully reconciled themselves to the fact that their daughter had married a man who came from nowhere in particular. Gerald had made this clear at Thanksgiving the first year, and every Thanksgiving since, through a series of comments so carefully constructed to sound like compliments that you had to examine them for several hours afterward to find the wound. Daniel does very well for someone who started with nothing, Gerald had said once, raising his wine glass slightly, as though making a toast. It speaks to a certain tenacity. Daniel had smiled and said thank you because he was the kind of man who picked his battles with the precision he applied to everything else. The marriage had been deteriorating for years by the time Camille sat across from him at the kitchen table that October evening, with her hands folded in front of her, and told him she wanted a divorce. She explained, already spoken to an attorney. She wanted the house, a settlement figure she had clearly not arrived at through any mathematical process Daniel could identify, and she wanted the process to be clean. Clean, Daniel said. Uncomplicated, she clarified. You've always been reasonable, Daniel. I'd like us to handle this like reasonable adults. He had looked at her across the table, across 9 years and a refinished porch and 100 dinners, and the particular silence of a house where two people have stopped really talking, and he had understood something in that moment with perfect clarity. She did not expect this to be a fight. She expected him to nod, sign where indicated, and return quietly to the nothing she believed he had come from. He said he would need to consult with an attorney before agreeing to anything. Camille had nodded with the measured patience of someone who had already won and was simply waiting for the other party to catch up. He found Priya Anand through a colleague who described her as meticulous, to the point of being slightly frightening. At their first meeting, Priya had spread Daniel's financial documents across her conference table, and after 40 minutes of silence, broken only by the scratch of her pen, she had looked up and said, "They don't know what they're looking at, do they?" Daniel had said, "I don't believe they've looked carefully." Priya had smiled. It was a small, precise smile that matched her small, precise handwriting. "All right," she said, "then let's make sure we know everything they don't." What followed was not dramatic in any visible way. There were no late-night revelations, no single smoking document that changed everything. What there was work, patient, meticulous, entirely consistent with the way Daniel Voss had always operated. He had, over the course of his career, built something that Camille and her family had never thought to ask about in any meaningful detail, because the visible markers of his financial life, a modest car, practical clothing, a restrained approach to vacations, did not align with their mental map of what wealth looked like. The Beaumonts measured prosperity in visible expenditure. Daniel measured it in different units entirely. The weeks passed. Camille moved through the house with the proprietary ease of someone who already considered it hers. She had lunch with her mother twice a week. She consulted with Garrison Holt, who had a reputation in this particular city's social circuit for being ferocious, a word that people used admiringly, as though the quality of an attorney could be measured in aggression rather than accuracy. Daniel continued going to work. He came home to a house that felt like someone else's. He refinished the last section of the porch railing that he hadn't gotten to in August. He was careful and thorough, because he was always careful and thorough. The first formal settlement meeting took place in Garrison Holt's offices on the 14th floor of a building downtown, in a conference room that had been designed to communicate that this firm occupied a different tier of existence than wherever you had come from. Floor 2 siling windows, a table of some dark, serious wood, water in a crystal pitcher, Garrison, Holt's cufflinks. Holt had walked Daniel through the settlement proposal with the tone of a man explaining simple mathematics to someone who was struggling. The figure Camille was requesting, a lump sum that represented, in Holt's framing, a fair accounting of the marital contribution, was substantial. The house, of course. Camille's continued use of the joint account, which had operated as their household account, was to be assumed until transfer of funds. The division of assets had been structured in a way that required accepting certain premises about Daniel's financial position, premises that turned out to be based almost entirely on his visible lifestyle rather than any actual investigation. "Mr. Voss," Garrison, Holt had said, capping his pen with a soft click, "I think if you look at this clearly, you'll see that this is a generous offer. Given your income and your current asset position, I think fighting this would cost you considerably more than it's worth." There was a pause in the room. Priya Anand wrote something on her legal pad. Daniel said, "We'll respond in writing." Holt had smiled the smile of a man who believed he understood exactly what that meant. What it meant, he was certain, was, he can't afford to fight this. He was not entirely wrong that Daniel was weighing cost carefully. He was simply wrong about which costs and why. Camille's confidence in the period that followed was something her family described as composure and her friends described as strength. She had lunch with her mother at the restaurant. They preferred the one with the valet and the Prex Fix menu, and Patricia Beaumont had patted her daughter's hand and said that it was all going to be fine, that Garrison Holt was the best there was, and that it had always been a concern, hadn't it? That Daniel had never truly. She searched for the word integrated into the family, into the life they had built together, into the tier of things. "He's not a bad man," Camille said in the voice of someone granting a significant concession. "Of course not," Patricia agreed. "But there are different kinds of men, and some of them simply don't." She lifted her hand in a small gesture that completed the sentence without requiring words. 6 months into the process, with negotiations stalled and both sides preparing for litigation, something happened that Garrison Holt would later describe as an ambush, though ambush implies surprise, and the only thing surprising about it was that it had taken them this long to look. Priya Anand filed the financial disclosure documents that litigation required. These documents, by law, had to be comprehensive. All assets, all accounts, all holdings, all interests. A forensic financial analysis conducted by a man who spent his professional life finding exactly what people didn't want found, applied to his own finances, was something that took the opposing side approximately 4 days to process before Garrison Holt called Priya's office and asked, with carefully maintained calm, if there had been a filing error. There had not been a filing error. Daniel Voss, whose car was 7 years old, and whose suits were clean but not pressed, had spent the previous decade building a consulting practice that had grown through a series of client referrals and reinvested earnings and extraordinarily conservative personal expenditure. Eye into something that the visible markers of his life gave absolutely no indication of. There were investment accounts, there were business equity positions. There was a separate property, a commercial space he'd purchased years earlier in a part of the city that had since become considerably more sought after, whose current appraised value would have startled people who assumed they knew what this man was worth. There were retirement accounts maxed every year for more than a decade. There were a great many things. The lump sum Camille had requested, which Holt had framed as generous, turned out to represent approximately 9% of Daniel's disclosed net worth, 9%. And here is where the law did what the law does, which is to say, it required Camille's side to recalibrate entirely, because in this state, the division of marital assets is governed by principles that do not care how the assets were kept, only when they were acquired, and to what extent they constituted marital property versus separate property. Priya had spent those months preparing exactly this argument. The consulting practice, built before the marriage in its foundational client relationships, though it had grown during the marriage, required careful delineation. The commercial property had been purchased with funds entirely traceable to a premarital account well before the wedding. The documentation was immaculate because Daniel had always kept immaculate records, which was either a professional habit or a preparation for exactly this moment, and perhaps it was both. What remained as genuinely marital property, the house, the joint account, certain investments established during the marriage, was still substantial. Camille was entitled to a fair share of it. No one was disputing that. What was being disputed was the story that Garrison Holt had walked into this process telling, which was the story of a man of modest means, whose wife's family had elevated him, and who was now facing the natural consequences of a marriage that had outpaced his station. That story was not supportable by the numbers. This is where we need to talk about what happened in Garrison Holt's office the week before the court date, because it is the part of the story that the people who were there do not tell the same way. Camille and her parents arrived together, which was the first indication that the confidence of the previous months had acquired an edge of anxiety beneath it. Gerald Beaumont, who had spent the last year making comments that floated above hostility, like clouds that never quite rained, sat in that dark wood conference room and did something he very rarely did. He asked a direct question. "How did we not know about this?" he said, looking at Garrison Holt with an expression that had moved from composed to requiring effort. Holt explained, in terms that managed to be simultaneously accurate and self-exculpatory, that the financial disclosure requirements of litigation had produced information that had not been available during the negotiation phase. That it was not uncommon for a party to a key, chose the word carefully, underpresent their financial position in early discussions, that this happened, and that they were now in a position to adjust their strategy accordingly. Gerald Beaumont looked at his son-in-law, who was sitting across the table. Daniel had come with Priya. He had a glass of water. He had not touched it. "You hid this," Gerald said. "Not a question. My client disclosed fully and completely when legally required to do so." Priya said before Daniel could speak, "Every document in that filing is supported by years of records. There is nothing hidden. There is only information your team did not seek." The distinction landed in the room with a weight that Garrison Holt spent the next 20 minutes trying to shift. What followed was a negotiation that looked nothing like the one Holt had walked in expecting to have. The revised settlement discussion was no longer about extracting maximum value from a man of limited means. It was about the proper legal division of a marital estate that turned out to be considerably more complex and considerably more substantial than anyone on the opposing side had bothered to determine before framing their demands. Camille, to her credit, was quiet during most of this meeting. If she had imagined this process would resemble the simple collection of what she was owed, the math of the previous months had revised that picture. She looked, for the first time in Daniel's recent memory, uncertain. Not devastated, not broken, just recalculating, seeing something she hadn't calculated. Gerald, however, was not quiet. Gerald was operating on the particular kind of anger that comes from discovering that you have said things in confidence about a person's worth, their origins, their fundamental adequacy, and that person had been listening from a position of knowledge that you lacked. It is a specific embarrassment, and it does not metabolize gracefully in men like Gerald Beaumont. "He should have disclosed this from the start," Gerald said. "It's deceptive." "Mr. Dissey." "Beaumont," Priya said very pleasantly, "your son-in-law is not required to open his financial records to settlement negotiations any more than anyone else is. He disclosed fully when the law required it. If your team constructed a strategy based on assumptions rather than due diligence, that is a professional matter between you and your attorney." She glanced at Garrison Holt in a way that was entirely professional and somehow also devastating. Gerald looked at Daniel. Daniel looked back. It was the first time in 9 years that Daniel had looked at this man and not felt the particular gravity of needing something from him. Approval, acceptance, the basic dignity of being seen as adequate. He didn't need anything from Gerald Beaumont. He had not needed it for some time. The freedom of that was extraordinary. "Gerald," Daniel said the first time in a decade he had used the man's first name without being invited to. "The offer Priya will put on the table this afternoon is fair. It reflects what the law requires and what the facts support. I'd encourage you to look at it carefully." He said it quietly. He said it without emphasis or theatrical weight. It landed anyway. The negotiation session ended without resolution that day, which was why the matter proceeded to the courtroom. And so we arrive back where we began. The judge reviewed the preliminary materials with the particular patience of someone who has sat with a great many disputes and understands that the truth generally surfaces if you give it enough time and keep the room organized. The morning session covered procedural matters, the admission of financial records, a scheduling discussion about expert testimony. It was technical. It was in the vocabulary of courtroom drama. Quiet. Then Garrison Holt made the statement. It came during a discussion about asset valuation timelines, and it was framed as a point of law, but it was pointed in the way that only personal contempt allows a legal argument to be pointed. He was addressing the judge, but he was speaking toward Daniel, and he said, and these were close to the exact words according to everyone who was in that courtroom. Your Honor, what we have here is a man who, whatever his subsequent financial situation, entered this marriage with no assets, no property, and no independent means of supporting the lifestyle this marriage provided. My client's family supported, subsidized, and in material ways, created the context in which Mr. Voss was able to develop his so-called practice. To now claim these assets as independent of the marital estate is, Counselor. The judge's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. Garrison Holt paused. Do you have documentary support for the claim that the defendant's family supported the development of his business practice? A beat. We are prepared to argue documentary support, the judge repeated. Do you have it? The pause that followed was 3 seconds long. In that conference room with the dark wood table and the crystal water pitcher, it might have been managed. In a courtroom, with the stenographer and a judge, and the particular acoustic property of rooms where consequences live, 3 seconds is a very long time. We will be presenting testimony, Your Honor. Testimony is not documents, Counselor. The plaintiff's earlier filings claim the defendant's business relationships were significantly developed through marital social connections. Mr. Voss's financial disclosure and supporting documentation trace every primary client relationship in his practice to a period predating the marriage. Your team has had access to those documents for weeks. The judge looked at the papers in front of her. Do you have anything that disputes the timeline in those documents? Another pause, shorter this time, but heavier. We are reviewing the full record, Your Honor. Priya Anand's pen did not move. She was already still. There was nothing to write here that she had not already written. The judge moved on. She was a woman who did not waste time performing for rooms, which was one of the qualities that made her effective. But Daniel would remember afterward the specific way she had looked at Garrison Holt in that pause. Not with hostility, not with drama, but with the flat, clear gaze of someone who had identified exactly what kind of argument she was being asked to evaluate and had made her assessment. The lunch recess came. Daniel stood in the corridor outside the courtroom, and Priya stood beside him, and she said nothing for a moment, which was unusual for her. Then she said, they filed nothing to counter the timeline. 11 weeks, and they filed nothing. Daniel nodded. They built their entire case on a picture of you that they never bothered to verify. She said it without anger, almost with something like wonder. They looked at your car and your suit and your in-laws' house, and they decided they already knew the math. People do that, Daniel said. Their mistake. Yes. The afternoon session was where Garrison Holt made his bid to reshape the narrative, calling a witness, a former colleague of Camille's, who attested to the social connections they had built as a couple. The professional introductions Camille had facilitated, the dinner parties that had included influential people. It was not nothing. Priya acknowledged in her cross-examination that Daniel had attended these events, had met people there, had on several occasions been introduced through Camille to individuals who were later clients. Then she asked the witness to identify from the client list and evidence which clients had originated from those connections. The witness named 3. Priya thanked the witness and introduced the revenue records showing that those 3 clients together represented 11% of the practice's total billings over the marriage years, and that the practice's 10 largest clients, representing the substantial majority of its revenue, were all established through Daniel's independent professional work in the period before or entirely separate from the marital social network. 11% versus the argument that the marital estate had materially created his success. The numbers didn't support the story. They rarely do. When someone finally looks at them carefully, the ruling did not come that afternoon. It rarely does. And the judge indicated she would take the matter under consideration and issue her decision in writing. But the shape of the day was visible to everyone in the room by the time the session ended. The arguments Garrison Holt had walked in planning to make had not survived contact with the actual record. The picture he had constructed of Daniel Voss, penniless origins, elevated by marriage, now seeking to claim assets he hadn't truly built, had been disassembled, document by document, timeline marker by timeline marker, with the methodical thoroughness of a man who spent his professional life doing exactly this kind of work. In the corridor afterward, Gerald and Patricia Beaumont moved toward the elevator with the bearing of people maintaining dignity under significant strain. Camille walked with them. At the elevator, she turned. She looked at Daniel across the marble corridor. This man she had shared 9 years with, whose car she had always thought reflected a kind of stubbornness rather than indifference to appearances, whose work she had described as something with accounting, whose porch she had liked sitting on in the evenings but never thought about who had made it smooth again. She said, "I didn't know." Daniel considered this. It was true, he thought. She hadn't known. Neither had her parents. Neither had Garrison Holt, despite being paid specifically to know things. They had all looked at him and composed a story from the fragments they found convenient, and then they had operated inside that story with complete confidence, because confidence was something the Beaumont world had in abundant, renewable supply. "I know you didn't," he said. It was not forgiveness. It was not condemnation. It was simply the truth stated plainly, which was another thing Daniel Voss had always been good at. The elevator arrived. The Beaumonts stepped in. The doors closed. Priya appeared beside him. "Ready?" "Yes," he said, and they walked toward the exit, and behind them the courtroom was quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when the day's work is done. The written ruling arrived 19 days later. The judge's decision was thorough and precise. It addressed the marital property questions with the clarity that the documentary record supported. The house in which both parties had a legitimate interest was to be sold, with proceeds divided, according to a formula accounting for the down payment sources and the maintenance contributions over the marriage years. The joint accounts were divided equitably. The premarital commercial property was determined to be separate property, not subject to division, consistent with the documentation provided. The consulting practice was examined carefully. The judge found that its growth during the marriage had been partially supported by marital labor and time, and awarded Camille a fair share, calculated from the marital origin client contribution and the time value of the marriage years, which was substantially less than the original settlement demand, but represented a real number, a legitimate accounting, a decision that the facts could sustain. It was just. Daniel had never sought to deny Camille what was just. He had only sought to deny her what was not. He wrote Priya Anand a note, an actual note, handwritten, because he was the kind of person who still did that, thanking her for the 11 weeks of work that had preceded the proceeding, for the precision that had made the document speak clearly, for the small smile in the first meeting that had told him, before any word of strategy was spoken, that she understood exactly what they were dealing with. She wrote back, "It was accurate work. Those are the best kind. Now, there is a particular thing that happens when someone who has underestimated you discovers the full picture. It can go several ways. Some people, in the privacy of their own recalibration, find a kind of honest reckoning. They examine the assumptions they carried, feel the discomfort of recognizing the shortcuts they took, and emerge from it with something genuinely revised. Others translate the surprise of being wrong into a different story, one where the fault lies in concealment rather than in their own failure to look. Gerald Beaumont, in the months that followed, took the second path. He was heard at his country club, describing the whole affair as a situation where Daniel had played games with financial disclosure, had been deliberately opaque, had used the system in ways that were, always the word, deceptive. It is a strange comfort to men like Gerald to believe that the problem was the other person's cleverness rather than their own blindness. It requires no revision of the self. It costs nothing except accuracy. Patricia Beaumont said very little, which was, in its own way, more interesting. She was a woman who had spent 50 years managing a household and a family and a social world that ran on the fuel of certainty. And one of her certainties, one she would not have named as such because it had never needed to be named, was that she could assess people. That the eye she had developed over decades for who people were, what they were made of, how much they counted, that this eye was reliable. Daniel had not done anything in her experience of him that had obviously contradicted it. He had been quiet, reasonable, unflashy. He had refinished porches and driven older cars and deferred to the room. And yet, she had been wrong, not about his character. He was quiet and reasonable, that much had proven accurate, but about the substance of him, about the accumulation of years of quiet work, about what the modest surface had been sitting on top of. In the Christmas card she sent that December, she sent one to everyone. It was automatic. It required no decision. She wrote in Daniel's card only, "Wishing you well." It was not much. It was from Patricia Beaumont, more than most people received. When they had complicated her picture of the world, Camille moved into an apartment on the east side of the city after the house sold. She enrolled in a graduate program, something she had deferred for years, citing busyness and timing and reasons that had seemed real at the time. She was, by the account of mutual friends who knew them both, doing the work of reassembling a life, which is difficult and unglamorous and does not resolve quickly. He had never borne her malice even in the worst months of the process, because malice requires a sustained investment of feeling that he had long since redirected. He stayed in the city. He moved into a 2-bedroom apartment with clean lines and good light, and he did not attempt to demonstrate his financial position through its furnishings, because that had never been how he thought about things, and it was not how he was going to start. His car, when the old one finally required replacement, was newer but not extravagant. He continued working with the precision and patience that had built the practice in the first place. He had dinner with Priya Anand once, several months after the ruling, and they talked about a documentary they had both seen about forensic accounting, naturally, and about a client of his who had presented a fascinating knotted books problem, and about the particular satisfaction of work that produces accurate results. She asked him at one point how he felt about the whole thing now. He thought about it for a moment, in the way that he thought about things. It was important, he said, that the record was accurate. That was always the thing. Not the outcome specifically, but that the numbers said the truth. And if they had continued with the original demand, if the case had been handled differently and you'd had to pay what they were asking for, then I would have, he said. If that's what the law determined was correct, I would have, but I knew it wasn't correct, and I knew that if we were rigorous enough, that would show. Priya nodded. She picked up her glass. Garrison Holt filed 2 motions to reconsider, she said. Both denied. I heard his firm lost a client shortly after the Beaumont family account. When? She said it without editorializing, because she was a precise person who did not require editorial decoration. Daniel said, I didn't ask them to do that. No, she agreed. You didn't. Gerald did it himself, apparently. Which is interesting. It was interesting. Gerald Beaumont, who had absorbed the lesson of the whole proceeding as Daniel's deceptiveness, had still, at some level, registered that Garrison Holt's 11 weeks of silence in response to Priya's documents represented a professional failure. It is possible to hold 2 contradictory positions simultaneously, especially when one of them cost you nothing. Gerald had moved the blame to Daniel for the humiliation of the outcome, and moved the blame to Holt for the professional mismanagement of the process. Both assignments were convenient. Neither was fully accurate. But together they allowed Gerald to continue as he had always continued, which was with the certainty that the world had not produced errors in him, only in others. Some people, Daniel had long since concluded, do not revise. You cannot engineer their revision. You can only ensure that the record is accurate, and then you go live your life. He went home from dinner that evening, Through the city he had always known and made his living inside, and he stood at the window of his clean, light-filled apartment and thought about what the last year and a half had required of him. The patience of it, the maintenance of stillness under conditions designed to produce motion, the discipline of knowing something and not performing it, of letting the documents do the speaking at the moment of their maximum effect. His mother, who still lived in the same city in a better apartment than the one he'd grown up in, an upgrade he had quietly arranged some years earlier, called him that night to check in. She was 71 and still had opinions about everything, which was a family trait. She asked how he was. He said he was fine. She asked if the other side had apologized. He said they hadn't. Exactly. Will they? He thought about the Christmas card, about Camel's 2 words in the corridor, about what qualified as apology in the vocabulary of people who had built a life on the principle that they did not need to apologize. In their own way, he said, in the way they're able to. His mother made a sound that was not quite agreement, but was not disagreement either. The sound of someone who has lived long enough to understand that justice rarely arrives in the form you imagined it would. You did the right thing, she said the whole time. I tried to. You did. She said it with the certainty of someone who had watched him his entire life, who had seen him figure things out when figuring out was all there was. Tenacity, she added, and there was something in her voice that made him understand she knew about Gerald's toast, even though he had never told her directly. Mothers know more than they are told. They said tenacity like it was a consolation prize. It isn't. No, he said. It isn't. He stood at the window a while longer after the call ended. The city ran its usual evening patterns below. Lights and movement and the ordinary human activity of people going from where they had been to where they were going. He had built something in the city over many years of ordinary evenings, without announcement, without seeking the validation of the people who were measuring him by their own scales. At 9 in the morning on the day the court's payment schedule had specified, the transfer had cleared, not the number they'd asked for, the number the facts had determined, the accurate number, the one the documents had built, statement by statement, account by account, across years of quiet, meticulous work. It had cleared at 9 in the morning, right on schedule, because Daniel Voss was the kind of man who was always on time. Garrison Holt had called him penniless, not in those exact words, but in every implication of his framing, in every assumption built into the strategy, in the condescension of a man who read a 7-year-old car and an unpressed suit and thought he understood what he was looking at. He had stood in that courtroom certain that the measure he had taken was accurate. He was not a foolish man, Garrison Holt. He was simply a man who had looked at the surface and been satisfied with it in the way that people are when they carry enough certainty to fill the space where inquiry should be. He had dressed the part of the ferocious attorney and brought his scales of justice cufflinks and his 14-floor conference room and his reputation. And he had walked into the record that Daniel and Priya had built across months of actual work, and records don't move. That is what Daniel had always known about them. They do not respond to charm or confidence or the particular social weight of a family like the Beaumonts. They sit on the page and they say exactly what happened, and if what happened is accurate, nothing can unmake it. He had built an accurate record. And at 9 in the morning, on the day that mattered, everything the record said had been there, exactly where he had put it. There is something worth sitting with at the end of a story like this. Something beyond the satisfaction of the reversal, though that satisfaction is legitimate and real. It is this: the people who dismissed Daniel Voss were not cartoons. They were not movie villains. They were people who had organized themselves around visible markers of worth, the right addresses, the right pedigrees, the right surfaces, and, in doing so, had developed a very effective blindness to everything those surfaces did not show. That blindness served them in most of their lives well enough, The world they moved through was largely composed of people who presented themselves exactly as they were. Daniel had simply never seen the point of that. Not as a strategy, initially, as a temperament, as the orientation of a man raised to figure things out rather than announce them. The strategy only emerged when the temperament was tested, when the certainty of other people's assumptions met the reality of what he had quietly built, and the two could no longer coexist in the same courtroom. He had not set out to deceive anyone. He had set out, as he always had, to do the work and let the work speak. It spoke, at the right moment to the right person, in the precise language of documents and timelines and account records that said, "Without rhetoric, without theater, here is what is true. That is enough, more than enough." It has always been enough for the people patient enough to believe it. If this story landed with you today, if you've ever sat across a table from someone who had already decided what you were worth and found out later they were reading the wrong balance sheet, I want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments. This community shows up for these stories because they recognize something true in them, and your experience is part of that. Hit the like button if you stayed all the way to the end, and subscribe if you want to be here for the next one, because there are more stories like Daniel's, stories about people who built something real while others were busy deciding they hadn't, and I intend to tell every one of them. Whatever someone has decided about you, before looking carefully, let them. Do the work. Keep the records accurate. The truth has a way of clearing right on schedule when the time comes.